My blood turned to ice as my boyfriend's father sneered street garbage across the silent table. 20 guests watched my humiliation. I rose slowly, whispering, "Enjoy the meal, Silas. I just terminated your company's only lifeline. I own your empire." I grew up in a motel room. Not for a week, not for a month while my parents figured something out, but for most of a year. Back when I was 13 and my mother had just lost the apartment we'd been renting on the east side of town. She cleaned motel rooms during the day and worked night shifts at a nursing home 3 towns over. And between the 2 jobs, she kept us fed, kept the lights on, and never once let me see her cry, though I know now that she must have. My father had left when I was 8. I don't remember much about him beyond the sound of a door closing and my mother's face afterward, which she arranged into something calm before she turned to look at me. I learned that from her, arranging my face, and it served me well in boardrooms 25 years later, though I never told her that's where I picked it up. We used food assistance. I ate the free lunch at school, the one that came with a card everyone in the cafeteria line recognized for what it was. I never hid any of it. Not because I was proud, exactly, but because hiding it would have meant agreeing it was something to be ashamed of. And even at 13, I understood that shame was a tool other people used on you, and I wasn't interested in handing it to them for free. At 17, I took a night job dispatching trucks for a small regional carrier. I sat in a cramped office with a landline and a paper schedule board, and I watched, night after night, how much time and money got wasted through nothing more sinister than bad information moving too slowly. Drivers sat outside loading docks for hours because nobody had told them the dock was backed up. Trucks ran empty on return legs because nobody had checked whether there was a paying load headed back the same direction. I became obsessed with it. Not the trucking business specifically, but the pattern underneath it. The way small blindnesses compounded into enormous waste. I was 17 years old, dispatching trucks from a folding chair, and I had decided I was going to fix an entire industry's information problem. Community college was the only option that made financial sense. I transferred after 2 years to a state university and graduated with more work experience than most of my classmates had accumulated in their entire lives, and considerably less sleep. At 27, I founded a software company built around everything I'd learned watching that dispatch board. It was not an overnight success, but 8 years after I founded it, the company had more than 400 employees and hundreds of enterprise customers, and I sold a controlling stake in a transaction that made headlines in the same industry press I'd once read as a teenager dreaming about exactly this outcome. The sale did not make me a billionaire. Taxes, employee equity, early investors all took their share. What it gave me was capital, and more importantly, credibility. I used both to start an investment firm specializing in something specific. Companies with good underlying operations and bad capital structures, run by founders who understood their industry brilliantly and their balance sheet not at all. I understood debt because I had grown up inside scarcity. I understood leverage because I had spent my entire childhood with none of it. By the time I met Evan, my firm managed a substantial pool of capital on behalf of pension funds, insurers, and family offices who trusted us to find exactly this kind of situation. I did not know, when I met Evan, that his father's company was about to become exactly that kind of situation. I met Evan almost 3 years before the dinner that would end up terminating his father's tenure at the company he'd built. Evan was an orthopedic surgeon, 41 years old, and he was one of the few people I'd dated who seemed genuinely uninterested in what my balance sheet looked like. He'd chosen medicine specifically, he told me early on, because it was a career that didn't run through his father's approval. His father had built a transportation company from 2 trucks into a fleet spanning thousands of vehicles, and he had opinions about what a proper career looked like, opinions that did not include a son who spent his days in an operating room instead of learning the family business. He thinks I wasted a good mind, Evan told me once, not with bitterness exactly, more like someone describing weather he'd learned to live with. He said as much, more than once, usually after a few drinks. Did you want to run it? No, that's the part he can't get past. It's not that I couldn't, it's that I didn't want it, and he's never been able to make sense of someone turning down something he built. What Evan did not know, for most of the time we were together, was that my investment firm was in the process of evaluating his father's company as a potential acquisition target. This was a legal boundary, not a romantic calculation. The transaction was covered by non-disclosure agreements binding my firm, the company's special transaction committee, and every advisor attached to it. Evan had no role at his father's company. He was not a director, not a trustee, not an executive, not an advisor in any capacity. I disclosed the relationship to my firm's investment committee the moment I understood what the target company was. My firm's compliance team placed a formal information barrier around Evan. He saw no financial models, no diligence reports, no valuation work, nothing that touched the transaction in any way. He knew, in the vague way people know their partner has a demanding job, that I was working on something large that fall. He did not know what it was, and I could not tell him. The banker running the sale process had contacted my firm directly, the way these processes typically start. Nobody at Evan's father's company learned that we were a bidder through any connection to Evan. The special committee running the sale, aware from early on that one leading bidder happened to be dating the founder's son, limited identifying details about that bidder within their own internal communications, in part because Silas had already demonstrated, before the process was even fully underway, that he could not be trusted not to interfere. He had tried, in the earliest weeks of the sale process, to contact potential buyers directly, outside the formal committee structure, attempting to negotiate his own post-closing role before any buyer had even submitted a formal offer. The committee's investment bank bank flagged this immediately as exactly the kind of behavior that could taint the process. Silas was informed through counsel that any further direct outreach to bidders would be treated as a serious breach of his fiduciary obligations as both CEO and a director. He stopped on the record. Whether he actually stopped is a separate question, one that would matter more later than it seemed to at the time. The company Silas had built looked, from the outside, like exactly the kind of enterprise that gets profiled in regional business magazines as a hometown success story. Nearly 7,000 employees, a fleet stretching into the thousands of tractors, dozens of terminals and warehouse campuses spread across the country, annual revenue in the billions. Silas himself had driven overnight routes as a young man, repaired his own equipment when he couldn't afford a mechanic, and survived downturns that had killed larger, better capitalized competitors. None of that history was fake, and none of it was undeserved. He had built something real. The problem was not the underlying business. Freight still moved. Trucks still rolled out on schedule mostly. The problem was the debt Silas had layered on top of a fundamentally healthy operation. Debt he had taken on with a confidence that had not been matched by the discipline required to manage it afterward. 3 years before the dinner, he had acquired a cold chain logistics competitor near the top of the market, financing far too large a portion of the purchase with borrowed money rather than equity. Integration dragged on far longer than projected. Maintenance costs climbed. Interest rates moved against him right as the company's variable rate debt was resetting higher. 2 of the acquired company's largest customers declined to renew once the disruption became visible. Operating earnings, which had run close to $300 million annually before the acquisition, fell by roughly half over the following 3 years. The company carried more than $800 million in funded debt, including a term loan of nearly $400 million coming due within 4 months of that dinner. The lenders holding that loan wanted one of 3 things before they'd discuss refinancing: fresh equity, a meaningful asset sale, or a change of control. Silas hated all 3, though he hated the third one most. Independent directors, several of whom had watched the debt situation worsen for years with growing alarm, hired an investment bank and formed a special transaction committee to manage the sale, insulating it as much as possible from Silas's direct involvement given his obvious conflict of interest. Our initial offer valued the business at just over $1.2 billion. We proposed refinancing the debt entirely, injecting $150 million of fresh operating capital, keeping nearly all terminals open, and retaining the overwhelming majority of employees. Competing offers were either priced lower or built around deeper layoffs and terminal closures. There was one obstacle standing between our offer and a signed deal, and it had nothing to do with price. Silas wanted to sell the company without actually surrendering control of it. He wanted an executive chairman title, veto power over hiring, strategic approval rights, continued access to the corporate aircraft he'd used for 2 decades. Our firm refused every one of those conditions because a change of control transaction that leaves the previous controller functionally still in control isn't a change of control, it's an expensive fiction. Silas told the board more than once that we would eventually bend. He was confident enough in that prediction that he said it out loud, at dinner, in front of 20 guests, without any apparent awareness of how wrong he was about to be proven. The dinner took place at Silas and his wife's estate, a sprawling property that had been featured at some point in the previous decade in a regional lifestyle magazine spread about successful local families. There were 20 people at the table that night. Family, mostly. 2 of the company's independent directors, invited as much for appearances as for actual company business. Several senior executives and their spouses. A banking couple who'd known Silas for decades. A handful of longtime friends who'd been present at enough of these gatherings over the years that they moved through the house with the easy familiarity of people who knew where the good chairs were. I had expected some tension going into the evening. Silas had made a handful of pointed comments about my background over the course of my relationship with Evan, comments that Evan had relayed to me afterward with a mixture of embarrassment and irritation, and I had braced myself for more of the same, in the vague way you brace yourself for weather you've been warned about but haven't personally experienced yet. What I had not expected, walking in that night, was for him to turn my entire childhood into a performance for 20 guests over the course of a single dinner. Before we even sat down, one of the independent directors, a woman named Margaret, who I would come to know much better in the weeks that followed, pulled Silas aside near the bar and asked, in a lowered voice that I happened to be standing close enough to overhear, whether the rumors circulating about the company seeking outside capital were accurate. Silas smiled the particular smile he had, the one that suggested he found the question slightly beneath him. "Whoever writes the check can put their name on the paper," he said, swirling his wine. "I'll still be running this company." I said nothing at the time. I filed the comment away, the way you file away a piece of information that confirms something you'd already suspected but hadn't yet had proof of. That single sentence, delivered casually at a cocktail hour, told me everything I needed to know about how Silas actually understood the transaction he claimed to be negotiating in good faith. He did not see a buyer as a new owner. He saw a buyer as a source of money that would, in his mind, simply replace one line on a balance sheet while leaving every actual decision exactly where it had always been, in his hands. Dinner itself started pleasantly enough. There was the usual small talk, the usual questions directed at the newer additions to the group, of which I was clearly one. Someone asked about my work in a general way, and I gave a general answer, the kind that satisfies polite curiosity without inviting further questions. Evan's mother, Marianne, was warm toward me in a way that felt genuine rather than performed, asking about my family, asking whether I had siblings, the ordinary questions questions that get asked at these gatherings. Marianne had been married to Silas for 43 years at that point. She was, by every account I ever heard, warmer than her husband, more attuned to other people's feelings, more willing to notice when a room had gone quiet in a way that meant something. But she had also spent 4 decades managing his temper, rather than confronting it directly. And I noticed, even before anything went wrong that night, the particular way she had of saying his name when he was heading somewhere unwise. Silas. Not sharp, not a rebuke exactly. More like a small hand on the arm, a reminder rather than an objection. I would hear her say it again, later that same evening, in exactly that tone, and it would do exactly as little good as it apparently always did. Evan sat beside me, and I could feel him relax slightly as the first course was cleared without incident. The way you relax when a feared confrontation seems to be, for once, not materializing. I don't think either of us realized at that point that the confrontation hadn't failed to materialize. It had simply been waiting for the right opening. It was Margaret, the independent director, who unknowingly opened the door. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, in the kind of lull where conversation drifts toward whoever hasn't spoken much yet, she turned to me and asked with genuine friendly curiosity where I'd gone to college. I started at community college, I said. It was a true and unremarkable answer, the kind I'd given dozens of times before in exactly this kind of setting, usually followed by a polite nod and a shift to the next topic. Silas leaned back in his chair. Community college leaves out the interesting part. The table's attention, which had been loosely scattered across 3 or 4 smaller conversations, gathered toward him with the particular speed that happens when someone's tone shifts even slightly. I felt Evan go still beside me. Dad. His voice had an edge I hadn't heard from him before, not directed at his father, not in front of other people. Silas ignored him entirely, the way you'd wave off a fly. He mentioned the motel, not vaguely, not in passing, but with specific, casual detail, as though he were relating an amusing anecdote, rather than exposing the most difficult year of my adolescence to 20 people I mostly didn't know. He mentioned my mother, working as a housekeeper, cleaning rooms for a living. He mentioned the food assistance, the free lunch program, all of it, laid out for the table like items on a menu. I sat very still. I have spent my career learning to arrange my face the way my mother once arranged hers, and I used every bit of that training in the seconds it took him to finish. But something in my chest had gone cold and hard, a sensation I recognized from exactly one other moment in my life, the day I stood in a foreclosure notice taped to our apartment door at 13 years old and understood, all at once, that the ground under me was not as solid as I'd believed it to be. Then he looked at me directly, not at the table, not at Evan, at me, and said the words that I would replay in my mind more times over the following months than I care to admit. Street garbage doesn't become respectable because my son puts it in a better dress. The table went completely silent. Not the polite silence of a lull in conversation, but the specific, airless silence of a room that has just watched something break. Marianne's fork stopped halfway to her plate. Margaret's eyes went wide and then, very deliberately, down to tablecloth. The particular look of someone trying to remove themselves from a moment without actually leaving the room. Evan stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. That's enough. His voice carried across the entire table, sharper than I had ever heard it. You don't speak to her that way. Not in this house. Not anywhere. I put my hand on his arm, gently, and looked up at him. Give me 1 second. He looked down at me, confused for half a beat, clearly expecting me to need defending, clearly ready to keep defending me regardless of what I said next. But something in my expression must have told him to wait, because he did, standing there with his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides. Under the table, out of sight of everyone, I opened my phone. My hands were steady. I want to be honest about that because it would be a better story if they'd been shaking. If this had been some spontaneous eruption of rage rather than exactly what it was, a decision I made calmly, in real time, based on information I'd been carrying for months about exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. I typed a single message to my firm's transaction counsel. Withdraw our indication of interest. Effective immediately. Preserve the file for the record. I sent it. I watched the little confirmation appear. Then I set the phone face down on the table, stood up, smoothed the front of my dress, and looked directly at Silas. Enjoy the meal, Silas. My voice was even, quiet even, but it carried in that silent room the way a whisper carries when everyone has stopped breathing to listen. I just terminated your company's only lifeline. He laughed. An actual laugh, short and dismissive. The laugh of a man who has never once in his adult life been told no by someone he considered beneath him, and has therefore never developed the muscle required to recognize it when it finally happens. You have no idea what keeps my company alive. That may be the first thing tonight you're wrong about. Marianne said his name again, the same small, useless Silas, and this time it didn't even seem to register with him at all. Evan and I walked toward the foyer together, his hand finding mine somewhere along the way, neither of us speaking. Behind us, I heard it before we'd even reached the door. A phone buzzing against the table. The company's CFO, a man named Daniel who I'd met twice before and who had always struck me as competent and quietly exhausted, pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and read whatever had appeared on the screen. He read it twice. I watched him do it, over my shoulder, through the doorway. The offer's been withdrawn, he said, to the table, to nobody in particular, in the flat voice of a man delivering news he already knows is going to detonate. Silas turned in his chair. Call them back. Nobody moved. Daniel didn't move. The banking friend didn't move. Margaret, still looking at the tablecloth, didn't move. Evan and I stepped out into the cool night air, and behind us, through the closing door, I heard Silas's voice rising, demanding someone explain what had just happened, demanding someone fix it, as though a phone call could undo a decision that had already been made and confirmed and time-stamped in a system he had no access to and no understanding of. Evan drove us home that night, and for the first 20 minutes, neither of us said much of anything. I watched the streetlights slide across the windshield and thought about my mother, about the year we'd lived out of a motel room, about the specific quality of shame that Silas had tried and failed to make me feel at that table. I did not feel ashamed. I felt something closer to clarity, the particular calm that comes after a decision has already been made, and there is nothing left to do but let its consequences unfold. I didn't know, Evan said finally, pulling into our driveway but not turning off the engine. About the firm, about what you'd sent. I couldn't tell you. It wasn't mine to tell you. He nodded slowly, processing that, and I watched him work through the layers of it, the same way I imagine I would have if our positions were reversed. His father's company, his girlfriend's firm, months of silence that hadn't been evasion, but obligation. Was your firm buying his company? He asked. We were considering it. We'd made an offer, and now you've withdrawn it because of what he said to you. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out through the windshield at our own front door, lit by the porch light we always left on. When he finally spoke again, his voice had a rawness to it that I hadn't expected. Do what you would do if you had never met me. I looked at him. Evan, I mean it. Don't factor me into this. Don't factor us into this. Whatever you would have done to any other founder who talked to you that way, do that. I'm not going to ask you to protect him. Not after what he said, not after years of comments I let slide because he's my father, and I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. He finally turned off the engine, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the drive had been. He needs to understand that there are consequences he can't talk his way out of, maybe for the first time in his life. I didn't say anything for a while. I reached over and took his hand, and we sat there in the driveway, in the dark, for longer than either of us probably needed to. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and reviewed everything my transaction counsel had already done in the 2 hours since I'd sent that first message. The withdrawal was formal and complete. Every document referencing our indication of interest had been flagged and preserved, per my instruction, in case anything about the sequence of events ever needed to be reconstructed later, whether for internal purposes, or though I hoped it wouldn't come to this, for some kind of dispute. I thought the deal was likely dead. I want to be honest about that too. I did not withdraw that offer as some kind of calculated negotiating tactic, some elaborate maneuver designed to extract better terms later. I withdrew it because I did not, in that moment, want to be in business with a man who had just used my childhood as a weapon in front of 20 people, and I had the power to act on that feeling immediately, and I used it. Whatever came afterward would come afterward. I genuinely did not know, sitting at that kitchen table at 11 o'clock that night, whether there would be an afterward at all. I was wrong about that, though it would take 3 weeks for me to find out how wrong, and the company would end up worth considerably less by the time I did. The morning after the dinner, Margaret did not call me. A less careful board, or one more inclined to protect a founder out of habit, might have moved immediately to smooth things over. Silas's board did not. They did what a responsible board is actually supposed to do when a transaction collapses under circumstances suggesting something is fundamentally wrong with the person running the company. They reopened discussions with the other bidders we'd beaten on price and terms. They asked the lenders for additional time before the deadline, and asked the lenders were willing to entertain, but only barely. And they commissioned a fresh, deeper round of diligence into the company's actual financial position. They also asked Silas directly exactly how much of his own personal capital he was willing to put into the business to help bridge the gap our withdrawn offer had left behind. His answer was none. He called it irresponsible, according to Margaret, to throw private money at what he characterized as a temporary liquidity issue rather than a structural one. He argued the board was overreacting to a single social dinner, that any competent buyer would eventually see past one uncomfortable evening and return to the table. Margaret told me later that this was the moment several directors, people who had served alongside Silas for years and generally given him the benefit of the doubt, stopped believing his repeated speeches about protecting the company. A man genuinely committed to protecting something he built does not, when asked to put his own money where his rhetoric has been for months, simply decline and blame the messenger. The alternative bids on the table were both worse and slower. The strategic bidder who'd lost to us initially remained interested at roughly $90 million below our original offer, but carried a longer antitrust timeline and involved closing several overlapping terminals. A distressed fund offered less still, close to $160 million below our number, with deeper layoffs and warehouse sales baked in. Neither solved the lender deadline as cleanly as our original offer would have. Meanwhile, the fresh diligence was turning up real problems. $50 million in deferred fleet maintenance, an insurance reserve underfunded by roughly $27 million, 2 contracts representing close to 10% of annual revenue heading into competitive rebid. None of it was fraud. It simply meant the company was less healthy than anyone outside Silas's own office had fully understood. 3 weeks to the day after the dinner, Margaret called me directly. Would you reconsider? She asked, without much preamble. I'll take it back to the full committee if there's any appetite on your side. I did not say yes immediately. It would be easy to tell this story as though I'd been waiting by the phone, savoring the moment Silas's board came crawling back. That isn't quite what happened. What actually happened is that I told Margaret I'd need to take it back to my own investment committee and rebuild the valuation from scratch before I could give her any real answer. Understood, she said. Take whatever time you need, but move quickly if you're willing to move at all. The lender deadline isn't going to wait for either of us. Saida and my team spent the better part of a week rebuilding the valuation from the ground up, treating every number the fresh diligence had surfaced as a fact to be incorporated rather than a talking point to be negotiated around. We did not pad the reduction to punish Silas for what he'd said at that dinner, and we did not soften it out of any residual guilt about how the deal had originally collapsed. We built the number the underlying facts supported and let the facts speak for themselves. The revised enterprise value came in at just over $1.18 billion, roughly $75 million below our original offer. Every dollar of that reduction was documented and traceable to something specific: the deferred maintenance backlog, the underfunded insurance reserve, the customer renewal risk on the 2 contracts approaching rebid. We added one additional factor to the model that had not been part of our original analysis, something my team had started calling informally founder transition risk, a quantified adjustment reflecting the real cost in terms of customer confidence and operational stability of a company whose founder had just demonstrated in front of his own board and 20 witnesses that he could not be trusted to prioritize the business over his own ego. Our new terms were considerably harder than the ones we'd originally proposed. No executive chairman title for Silas, no veto power over hiring decisions, no strategic approval rights over anything going forward, no continued access to the corporate aircraft. In exchange, the company would receive $175 million in committed liquidity and modernization funding, formal retention commitments for employees below the executive level, an independent compliance committee with real authority, and a structured search process for a new chief executive to replace Silas entirely. When Margaret presented these terms to the full board, Silas reportedly stood up before she'd even finished the summary. "She's using this company to settle a personal score, Margaret." His voice, according to 2 directors who described the meeting to me afterward, had risen sharply enough that someone had quietly closed the conference room door. "Then explain the maintenance backlog without mentioning dinner," Margaret said. He could not. Nobody in that room could explain $50 million of deferred equipment repair, or a $27 million shortfall in the insurance reserve, or 2 major contracts heading toward competitive rebid by pointing at a single social dinner that had happened 3 weeks earlier. Those numbers existed independently of anything I had said or done. They had been accumulating quietly for years, under Silas's direct oversight, and no amount of framing the transaction as personal retaliation could make them disappear from the diligence report sitting in front of every director in that room. The board voted 6-1 to recommend the revised transaction to shareholders. Silas cast the lone dissenting vote, a fact that would matter less than he seemed to believe it would, given that the company's charter did not grant him the ability to unilaterally block a transaction the majority of his own board had approved. Then came the shareholder vote itself, the mechanism by which the revised transaction would either be approved or die entirely, taking the company's chances of meeting its lender deadline down with it. Silas personally owned close to 30% of the outstanding shares. A family trust established decades earlier controlled another 18%, but those shares were voted not by Silas or any family member directly, but by an independent corporate trustee bound by fiduciary duty to the trust's beneficiaries, a duty that did not automatically align with whatever Silas personally wanted. I did not contact that trustee. Evan did not contact that trustee. Nobody at my firm reached out through any channel, formal or informal, to try to influence how those trust shares would be voted. We did not need to. The trustee, along with every other institutional shareholder holding stock in the company, received the same fairness materials, the same financing commitments, the same detailed comparison of our offer against the alternative bids still technically on the table. They were making an informed decision based on documented facts, not on anything either side had whispered in a hallway. Roughly 68% of shares voted in favor of the transaction, comfortably above the threshold required for approval. Silas stared across the boardroom table when the final count was read aloud. "This is my company." Margaret closed the binder in front of her without looking up. "It's a corporation, Silas, not an inheritance with employees. The transaction itself would be financed through a combination of roughly $480 million in fund and co-investor equity, plus committed senior financing covering the remainder, close to $700 million. There was no single dramatic check written by me personally, no overnight seizure of control in the way Silas seemed to be picturing it in whatever version of events he was constructing for himself. There were lawyers finalizing antitrust filings, lenders being paid off according to a defined schedule, insurance policies being transferred, and a long list of closing conditions that still needed to be satisfied before anything became final. The closing date was set for 9 weeks after that dinner. Silas signed the necessary documents, eventually, though not willingly, and according to people who worked closely with him during that period, he still seemed to believe that once the papers were signed and the transaction closed, the fact that his name remained on every truck in the fleet would somehow translate into some version of practical control being handed back to him. That assumption turned out to be the final one I would need to correct, and I intended to correct it as clearly and completely as every assumption that had come before it. 9 weeks after that dinner, the acquisition closed. My firm's holding vehicle took just over 82% of the voting control in the company Silas had spent his entire adult life building. He received the same per-share consideration that every other shareholder in his class received, no better, no worse, exactly what the terms of the transaction provided for. He was, when all the paperwork finally settled, still a genuinely wealthy man. What he had lost, entirely and irreversibly, was control. That morning, the company's name was still stenciled across the headquarters building, still painted on the side of every truck in the fleet, still printed on the sign at every terminal across the country. Silas arrived for the first board meeting under the new ownership structure as though none of that had actually changed anything, as though a signature on a closing document was a formality rather than the precise legal instrument that had just redefined who he was answerable to. He walked into the conference room, looked directly at me, me and said, "You may own paper. This is still my company." I let the room settle for a moment before I answered him. "No," I said. "It stopped being your company the morning that deal closed." He gave a short, bitter laugh, the kind meant to signal contempt rather than actual amusement. "You think buying votes makes this your empire? I don't think it does." I reached down and set the closing binder on the table in front of me, the physical weight of 9 weeks of legal work landing with a small, definite sound against the wood. "I own your empire." The room went completely silent, not because the line itself was especially dramatic, spoken aloud in isolation, but because every signature contained in the binder now sitting on that table made the statement precisely, legally, undeniably true. There was nothing left to argue about. The argument had already been settled in writing by people whose signatures carried actual weight. Weeks before this particular moment in this particular room, the new board had already been formally seated as part of the closing. I chaired the meeting in my capacity as the controlling shareholders' representative. Daniel Cho, the CFO whose phone had buzzed with the withdrawal notice all those weeks earlier, remained on as interim chief executive while a formal search for a permanent replacement began. Evan was not on the board. He was not being given a job at the company, was not angling for one, had never wanted one. He was still, that morning and every morning after, a practicing surgeon. This was never a family coup dressed up as a corporate transaction. It was a change of control, executed cleanly, according to terms that had been documented and voted on and agreed to by a substantial majority of the company's actual owners. I introduced the motion to terminate Silas's employment as chief executive and remove all remaining executive authority he held, effective immediately. The board voted yes, unanimously among the directors present, Silas himself having no vote on a matter concerning his own removal. "You cannot fire me from the company I built," he said, once the vote had been read into the record. "Building something does not give you permanent ownership of everyone inside it." He received the severance his employment contract entitled him to. He was given a reasonable window of time to collect his personal belongings from the office he had occupied for decades. There was a formal transition process, documented and dignified, exactly the kind of process a departing executive is legally entitled to. No security guards were called to escort him from the building. Nobody applauded when he finally walked out. I did not arrange for any of that, and I would not have wanted it if someone else had. The outcome itself was the entire statement. It required no additional theater. We kept the company's name on every truck, every terminal sign, every piece of correspondence that went out under its letterhead, because customers had built decades of trust around that name, and employees had spent entire careers helping build what it represented. Silas had assumed, I think, that losing control would mean losing everything, that the two things were functionally identical in his mind. I left him rich. What I actually took from him was the one thing he had always mistaken for a birthright rather than what it actually was, a responsibility that could be, and eventually was, taken away when he stopped honoring it. The power to decide what happened to everyone else inside the company he no longer ran. The $175 million modernization program began within the first month. Deferred maintenance that had been pushed back for years finally got scheduled and completed. The dispatch systems, running on infrastructure that hadn't been meaningfully updated in over a decade, went out for replacement. Most of the company's terminals remained open. The overwhelming majority of its nearly 7,000 employees kept their jobs, kept their roots, kept the routines they'd built entire lives around, undisturbed by the change happening several layers above them in an org chart most of them would never need to think about. Silas never apologized. Not to me, not to Evan, not as far as I ever heard to anyone. He sent a single letter months after the closing, and I still have it. "You were waiting for a chance to take what I built." I answered it once, and only once. "I was willing to pay more before I met the version of you who believed that ownership meant no one could ever tell you no." He never replied.